Hello everybody, welcome back to Scottish Independence Podcasts. This week we are sharing 12 insights we got from the Scottish Currency Group Conference.
Hi everyone.
One of the reasons we were at the conference in the first place to learn.
That's good. So they're sort of like pointers.
So the first thing I learned, and it did surprise me, that the Welsh Government paid an independent academic to have a look and see what currency options there would be for an independent Wales. The expert in question was a very engaging Frenchman called Dr. Thibault Lorangeois, I think that's how you pronounce it, from Aalborg University. And our first insight is say no to Sterlingisation.
In 2014, Scotland said, we would keep the GBP, but Westminster said absolutely not. So then there was this plan B, keep using the sterling, but without a formal agreement. And I'm going to say it loud and clear, this is a terrible idea. Like this is basically currency, monetary, fiscal suicide in waiting. So don't do that. Now, it's interesting to see that in its 2022 report, which was called A Stronger Economy with Independence, the Scottish government argued in favour of what they called a staggered approach to currency change, whereby Scotland would keep using the pound sterling until the time is right to move to a Scottish pound. Okay, I am speechless. Like, it's literally, this is basically created the conditions to never be able to issue your own currency because you're going to create so much financial instability, speculation. Like this is awful. There's a study from Commonwealth that argued very sensibly in favor of introducing Scottish currency ASAP.
So
that's very
quite clear.
Yeah, that's pretty clear, isn't it? And indeed, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, Commonwealth have been saying it, and the currency group people have been saying this as well, and other commentators in the indie movement, some with considerable economic experience. And yet, just 2 years ago, that paper came out and was still saying it. It is disappointing, let's say that, at least. And the Scottish government have not moved on and somehow can't just kind of, I was going to say grasp the nettle, but I think I mean grasp the thistle.
I'm not confident that they understand yet why it would be a terrible idea. I'm
hearing people that I respect because I've read quite a lot of their stuff. So, for example, the Commonwealth team. So if they come out and say that, I will give that weight because, like you were saying earlier, it's not particularly, I don't have the economic nous to quite get all the ins and outs of it. So, I'll sort of go with their advice because I respect them and I know how much work they put into their reports. But has the Scottish government put in that? What I find disappointing is it's not that the SNP have a different opinion about the best way forward for currency. It's that they won't engage, or they haven't so far really engaged with quite considerable people and people with considerable experience and knowledge who disagree with that and who would go for Scottish pound ASAP. And if there was a dialogue of some sort, you'd think, well, okay, let's see where that goes, because obviously people don't agree about everything, but you have to have a dialogue, I think, and that's what I find disappointing. I
agree. I mean, even whether it's a citizens' assembly or something, or whether it's a round table of people with different views, there must be some way of progressing.
I mean, it can just be that the SNP issue an invitation to Commonwealth team, maybe Tim Rideout and Ian Stewart and a few other people, and say, come along, let's have an afternoon when we talk to each other and we present what our thoughts are and we tell each other what we think of their thoughts. That would be not hard to do.
It sounds very civilised, doesn't it?
Yes, civilised.
Yeah. We're sticking with Dr. Thibault at the moment. When he did his research into what are the best currency options for Wales, would you believe the best one, having done his analysis, was for them to have an independent Welsh pound? So our second insight was currency options for an independent Wales.
Transitioning to the Eurozone wouldn't change the peripheral status, but merely reposition Wales from the fringe of one currency area to another. So it's basically like going from one toxic relationship to another toxic relationship. Okay, not the best idea you could have. I turn to the part about introducing a Welsh pound here are the arguments. There are two, but they're very strong. The first one is what you can do from a political perspective. Your autonomy is maximum. Fiscal, monetary, exchange rate. I could have even added like financial regulation, and also financial stability. You get a better grip over market conditions, and you especially remove any risk of default on your public debt as long as there's no original sin, meaning the central bank does not borrow in a foreign currency. Okay, so if you have the Welsh pound or the Scottish pound, do not borrow in euro, do not borrow in GBP anymore. Okay, that's just risky for nothing. And that's the main predictor of government defaults.
That's a real lesson, isn't it? You can run up public debt as long as it's in your own currency. If you start borrowing euros or GBPs, then you're always beholden to repaying in those currencies, which you may not have. That's one of the big advantages of having your own currency, of course, is that you can do that. Yeah. But isn't that interesting, the independent expert, Wales, which we don't think of as having anything of the resources that Scotland's got, and yet still...
Well, it doesn't have the natural resources that we have.
It's got a lot of fresh water that it's supplying England, and it's got electricity generating powers that we don't have.
You're right. I mean, there's plenty of big reservoirs up in the north of Wales. Pipelines go straight over to Manchester, and well, Birmingham in particular gets its water from North Wales.
Dr. Thibault said there, investors like predictability. So here he just expands on that thought. So our insight number 3 is be predictable, but don't be too predictable.
There's this idea in even in mainstream economics, and I think that's a valid point of mainstream economics, that the most powerful policy moves are the ones that are not anticipated by the markets. So I would say, actually, you need to create predictability. And how to do it? Okay, you need to have a plan in terms of everything current account related, especially trade related. You need to be able to have forecasts on what your inflows and outflows will be as far as incomes are concerned. So obviously, the state pension would probably be managed by, now we're talking about Scotland, would be managed by the Scottish government. But what about the private pensions? It's very likely that people would receive payments in Great British pound. Okay. And so all those things, obviously, would need to be considered, put into like spreadsheets, plans, and so on and so forth. So this way you create, you show, okay, we've got a plan, we know where we're going. You would probably need to change your tax system, like to make it more consistent with the political orientations of Scotland, to make it consistent for a standalone country. Probably the Scandinavian model as a whole would probably be a good influence. At the same time, keep in mind that you may want to keep some room for surprises. So if you divulge everything, the financial markets will anticipate and sometimes misinterpret. Let's face it, they're not perfect. So you want to be strategic in how you divulge information. And one aspect I didn't delve into details, but is Singapore, when you look at their exchange rate regime. So Singapore, they have no central official parity. Okay, so they have a band. Okay, there's a band. That band is defined against a basket of currencies, okay? And it crawls. Okay, so you have a band that crawls against a basket of currency. Now get this, neither the width of the band, the composition of the basket of currency, and the speed of the crawl is officially disclosed. Okay, so basically from like an external perspective, they may as well be floating. It wouldn't make much of a difference.
That was interesting, wasn't it?
One of the things I found really inspirational about this conference actually was how international its perspective was. And they were drawing examples from, Singapore. Later on, they draw from Dublin, they draw from Iceland. It just was a really wide perspective. It felt like a proper look at some really important things.
Yeah, that's true. That's true, actually. What I'm left thinking about after listening to those 3 clips, especially maybe that last one, was just that he was sort of saying, well, yeah, of course, you become an independent country. You just have to have thought through a bit what your strategy is. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are tactics that will change from month to month, but your overall strategy, and you certainly got it in that clip about, you're going to have to think about don't give too much away too quickly. You don't have to say everything, and the markets will pick up and they'll make decisions, but they get it wrong. And make sure you've got kind of wiggle room. So actually, there was a lot in that. It took me a wee while to pick up his accent, I have to say.
Well, we're going to move on to another accent now. This was another great speaker at the conference. This is Jon Helgi Egilsson, who is the former chair of the Icelandic Central Bank. And he did make the point at the conference, he was the chair after all the financial crashes. He wasn't there when they happened.
Insight number 4 is lessons that Scotland can draw from Iceland's banking crash.
Before 2008, we had banks that were basically based on European law and rules. They utilized the freedom that the membership of the European Economic Area gave them. And they went on to shopping spree with borrowed money. That's what they did. Icelandic companies. A lot of companies in the UK that the Icelandic banks bought. But it didn't go so well when the liquidity dried up and they couldn't refund themselves. They basically became bankrupt. All of the banks, they just collapsed, all of them. And that basically brought the whole economy to its knees. And why? Because we could not access the payment system. They were the resource of money creation. And people lost their savings. This is the problem with banks, which is not the issue of this lecture here, but this is what happened in Iceland. But luckily, we had our own currency, so we could get in control again. And we also had the independence. We passed emergency laws, basically to save what was left of the banks. We split them up into good and bad banks. And we imposed currency controls. Currency controls were fundamental in the sense that it meant that everyone that had a claim in any Icelandic entity, they had a claim in Icelandic kronur, in the local currency. And we were in control of that. That meant that big banks, German banks, French banks, UK banks, hedge funds, and everyone that was involved in the craziness pre-2008, they were basically locked in. And we could then go and negotiate without any control of the currency, without any control of what legislation we could pass. We would not have been able to do this. So faced with capital controls and being locked in the local currency, we negotiated sensible terms with them, and it resulted in Iceland debt levels being adjusted to reasonable, sensible levels. Now, this prevented Iceland from becoming another Greece, which is a tragic example of what can happen if you don't control your own currency. And the problem with FX is that if it's FX and you don't have control, then it must be paid back. You have to negotiate or you can default. But we managed to avoid all of this. And the same thing is for Scotland having its own currency. It provides control. It provides the mitigation means to default risk or avoid risk. And it's optimizing for economic growth.
That's very good.
It is, isn't it? So he's being very clear there that, terrible things happen, which wasn't, Iceland was impacted by the financial crash, but it gave them a route out of it. Having their own currency didn't prevent the bad thing happening to them because it happened to everybody. It just gave them a route out of it.
And insight number 5 then is the importance of controlling your own currency.
The British pound is optimized for the UK as a whole, and the euro is optimized for the Eurozone as a whole. And the question that I would be asking is, why would Scotland settle for anything less than its own currency to optimize its own economic future? But currencies are to many something which is complicated. In my mind, it is in many ways like having a stock in your company. And you're using that stock or equity to pay for whatever you want to pay for. And what does that mean? It basically means that if you have a Scottish pound in the Scottish ink, then it means that you will feel it when Scotland is doing well, because it will appreciate. But you will also feel it when it's not doing so well, and you will suffer. And that will have consequences. But that's part of the feature of your own currency.
And I think the powerful thing that right from the beginning, optimize for your own economy, and the UK, the pound is optimized for the UK economy. It's not optimized for the Scottish economy. And that's an interesting point.
Insight number 6, 300 years is nothing.
The reality of Scotland is that you're a part of the Union from 1707. And you think that's a long time to be a part of a union? Iceland lost its independence in 1262. So, it's not a long time. We got our independence first in 1908 and then full independence in 1944. And the reason why Iceland lost its independence in 1262 was in a similar way as Scotland. It was, economic problems. The problems in Iceland were that, there was a lot of ice around the country. It was hard for ships to come to Iceland. So the Icelanders basically said, we give up. They went to the Norwegian king and said, can you please make sure that there will be ships going to Iceland? If you do so, we're willing to give up our independence. And it took 800 years to regain it. So I would be very careful of that.
So next time someone says to us on the street stalls, 300 years, it's just too long. I mean, we're just part and parcel of the Union, and we'd never be able to kind of separate out from that. We can say, well, what about Iceland?
We certainly can. Okay, up next is Roger Mullin.
He was a SNP MP, I think, from 2015, I think it was. And I've heard him talk before about the Scottish stock exchanges, which I think is what he's going to be talking about here, isn't it?
It is. And what I learned that I didn't know is that at one point, not so long ago, Scotland had 5 stock exchanges.
So that's our insight number 7, the history of Scotland's stock exchanges.
What is a stock exchange for? Basically, it raises funds for investment through things like selling stocks, through bonds and other types of securities, as they're called. And investors can enter that marketplace through an exchange and buy stocks, buy bonds and the like. And that provides often very competitive money to allow businesses, amongst others, but also municipal authorities and the like, who can issue bonds, to have funding to allow them to invest. So it's an important part, I would argue, an important element. It's not a magic wand, but it is an element that is important to help countries grow. Now, before the coming of formal and what we understand as modern stock exchanges, there was, with businesses that had developed hundreds of years ago, there was always a bit of ad hoc, very small scale buying and selling taking place. But it was certainly not fit for when we come to the Industrial Revolution and times of great growth in society. It wasn't fit for purpose. And so stock exchanges, where it was formalized, where there was a floor at which you could come along and trade and see things physically happening and taking place, and where there was growing and effective legal requirements and regulation and the like that was taking place. So, what happened to Scotland? Did Scotland ever have a stock exchange? Well, Scotland had more than one. In 1844, 2 exchanges were created, one in Glasgow and one in Edinburgh. In 1845, a third was created in Aberdeen. In 1879, a fourth was created in Dundee, and I have to say, slightly to my surprise, I found out that a fifth stock market was created in Greenock in 1888, all serving at the time, of course, predominantly national or local markets. Very different from the type of exchanges that we have today. They were hugely important to Scotland's development, however. They were important players in the development of the railways, raising funds for that, for private capital and the like. Important in engineering, in shipbuilding, hence in Greenock, food and drink, and also for what are bonds, like municipal bonds. By 1900, public listed companies in Scotland through Scottish stock exchanges had paid up capital of over £408 million. If I put that into today's money, that would be the equivalent of £42 billion through small local stock exchanges. And they helped that time, of course, fuel much of the change that was happening in Scotland. However, when you look more recently at what has been happening, in the 20th century, there was a trend towards increasing centralisation. There was a strong pull, a strong magnet from the south, particularly in the London area, and gradually these exchanges became somewhat smaller in their significance. Fast forward 60-ish years, in 1962 there was a report that was very important, the Jenkins report, and that became a spur to create a single stock exchange for Scotland. And eventually, a full merger of all the then existing exchanges took place, and a full merger in 1971 to create the Scottish Stock Exchange. How long did the Scottish Stock Exchange last? 2 years. In 1973, it was completely submerged within the London Stock Exchange. And all the services and the other things that are associated with it went south.
I always enjoy listening to Roger Mullen. He always just kind of gets my attention, and I've heard him talking about exchanges in Scotland and losing them again, and in particular how more recently, I mean, I'm thinking last 15 years, there have been moves to try and re-establish something in Scotland. It hasn't come to anything, but one of the reasons for doing that was that so that if people have got money that they'd want to invest, there would be a way of doing that when you wanted to invest it specifically in Scotland, in Scottish firms. So of course you can do that to some extent through the London Stock Exchange, but to have something that was set up for Scottish business, enabling and making it easier to get inward investment into those businesses, that would be brilliant. That must be something that is, not helping Scottish industry and development at the moment.
I had no idea that we had stock exchange as recently as 1973.
Yeah. So you've got individual exchanges, presumably focusing on the individual needs of businesses in that area. That you just think, yes, let's do that. That would make sense.
And following on from that, our insight number 8 is the opportunities that would open up for Scotland if we were to reinstate stock exchanges, particularly if we were in the EU.
10 years ago, at the time of the independence referendum, there was a study undertaken at the same time, and it said that the Dublin Stock Exchange supported 2,000 jobs in Ireland directly, and it was worth over 200 million in local economic impact per year. That was before, in 2018, it decided for a whole host of reasons to join an organisation called Euronext, which was the development of a federation of stock exchanges in Europe. These exchanges involved the stock exchanges in Amsterdam, Brussels, Lisbon, Milan, Oslo, Paris, Dublin. They share a very sophisticated platform for trading, and they use a system called the Optic platform. To give you an idea of how significant they have become, they currently have on offer over 56,000 bonds from over 100 countries internationally. And Dublin is now part of that federation. So I am not equipped to decide what the best way for Scotland to establish and re-establish itself. Scotland may be interested in being part of the Euronext family, given our ambitions to re-enter the European Union. However, I have some hopes that I hope those who might be interested in studying how to set one up for Scotland might be interested in looking at. Firstly, Scotland is in an ideal place to become known for establishing credentials for green companies and green bonds. And that would give us a specialism, I think, that would serve Scotland's interests as well as move things forward in international terms. I also think one of the things that I always find as a tragedy, our excellent universities are often creating very significant spin-off companies, but they're so successful, many of them have to effectively move south or overseas to raise the capital that's needed. Perhaps we could have a fairly unique exchange that partners include the universities to look at how we can bring systems together. And in that way, I think we could help to grow Scotland's economy.
That's quite an interesting idea, isn't it?
Yeah.
It may be that the choice to set up a stock exchange may depend on permission from Big Brother down the road. Who knows?
It would while we're still not independent, but then, so yet another reason why we should be independent.
Yeah, but that was quite an eye-opener. 2,000 jobs in Dublin directly supported by the stock exchange. 2,000 jobs we could have.
Oh, it would just make you great, wouldn't it?
It really would.
Now, our next insight isn't to do with currency as such, but it is to do with the way we thrive as a country. So, insight number 9, Craig Dale from Commonweal explains why we need more plumbers.
If you think that we can just hire a bunch of plumbers from Norway to lay pipes for district heating systems, you're not going to get a Green New Deal that way, mostly because everywhere on the planet is facing the same climate emergency on the same timescales. So we all need those plumbers. So it is going to be a case of we really need to start reshaping the entire economy. We've seen the struggles we've been going through to get things like houses properly insulated. And anyone who's tried to do it themselves, trying to get traders to come in, it's impossible. There's just not the people there to do it. The challenge of the Green New Deal is not finding the boots on the ground, it's finding the feet to fill them. To take that insulation example, if you think of the young apprentice who will be insulating your house in 5 years' time, that person is in high school right now. What kind of education is leading them to the path that will lead them to insulating your house? The young apprentice who is insulating the final house in the Green New Deal on the eve of 2045, when Scotland is supposed to be net zero, they're not born yet. So what is the pathway to get them into that job?
I always love Craig's way of explaining things.
It's very good, isn't it? Suddenly you go, oh wow, yeah, plumbers.
I've just been reading that open letter from scientists to the Nordic Council, trying to warn them about the perilous state of the Atlantic conveyor, the thing that keeps the Gulf Stream.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
You know, insulating our houses could be an existential matter before we know it. So, suddenly everything just feels more urgent than it maybe did. This is from Malin Johansson. who's the chief executive officer of the Landsbanki, which the Faroese bank, such a tiny place compared to Scotland, and yet they have so much more power than we have. And just from the way she describes themselves as an independent country within the Kingdom of Denmark, we can't say that we're an independent country within the Kingdom of the UK, can we?
So insight number 10 is a look at devolution Faroese style.
Faroe Island is an independent country within the Kingdom of Denmark. But the Faroe Island, being far away from Denmark, we have our own language. We do not speak Danish, we speak Faroese, and we have our own culture. And the Danish economy is an industrial economy, very dependent on competitiveness, and we are a resource economy, fishing and fish farming. But we are independent, and we have it's governed by the Home Rule Act of 1948. But in 46, we had an referendum on independence, and we voted yes. But the Danish Parliament didn't accept that, sent the Faroese Parliament home, and the end of that was that we got the Home Rule Act. So there is a lot of dispute about that still in the Faroe Island. But still, we have the Home Rule Act. In the Home Rule Act, there are a list, and there are Faroese matters, and then there can be matters that can be negotiated and we can take over, and then there are Danish matters that we cannot. And the Danish matters are foreign policy, military defense, the legal system, and also the monetary system, which is determined the interest rate and the currency. Yeah? But we have the fiscal independence. Both the local municipalities and the central government, we set our own taxes. So we finance everything on our own. We collect taxes to finance. So we decide every decision to what we want to build, what we want to invest in is our own. We get a grant from the Danish government. It used to be about a third of the income. Now it's only 80% of the income. My belief is that we need to get that down to zero before we can take a decision if we want to be a totally independent country or we still want to be. We do not have our own currency. The currency is the Danish krone. So we do not have anything to say when it comes to the interest rate, and we do not have any control of the exchange rate. We have 4 Faroese banks in the Faroe Island, but they are controlled by Financial Supervisory Authority. So they are still a Danish matter, even though we can negotiate to get that to the Faroe Island. We have established the governmental bank, and it was established in 1978, and the first managing director was hired in 88, just before our very huge financial crisis. And the main task of the government, the bank, is to the liquidity of the government, the debt of the government, and also the financial stability, which is an assignment of a national bank. So 3 things, the liquidity and the debt and financial stability. We had a very huge crisis in the 90s, very large, and all the liquidity of the government was tied in the banks, and they couldn't use it because they would make the situation much worse. So at that time, we decided on an act that the government has to hold 15% of the GDP in liquidity. And that corresponds to 3.7 billion Danish crown. So if we go below that, next time we go out to borrow, we need to borrow to get the liquidity up to 50. So it's kind of our reserves. And it's very good because every time we get a rating, which is, you can say the rating, Moody's rates the Faroe Island, which is, you can say how the world see the Faroese economy. The better rating, the better it is. The worse rating, the worse it will be. But they emphasize that we have a very good liquidity, so that's very good. So that it's an act that every politician respect. So instead of placing it in the Faroese bank, we invested abroad. So we invested in shares and bonds, but abroad.
So what occurred to me listening to it, the way she described, the different levels of things that they could and couldn't influence. But actually, I sort of thought, well, maybe that's a bit like, Devo Max. Scotland would be in charge of everything except, well, it was very similar. The currency, so the exchange rate, defence. Can't remember what else might have been probably foreign affairs. So I thought, well, maybe when she's describing that, she's describing what Scotland would be able to do, even short of independence, if we could just get Westminster to go along with it. And they've just gained such amount of experience in how to keep their kingdom within, the kingdom within the kingdom, as it were, how to keep that workable and stable. And I say it's just so admirable because they've only got 50,000 people.
And fish farming is there. And the thing that I heard her say that I think is perhaps the big difference that allows them to do all that stuff, they've set up that government bank and they can take on debt, which means they can borrow. And I think that's financing a lot of their infrastructure and investment, because we hear about their tunnels and their infrastructure. And actually the next little clip is specifically on that point. And if you think about the issues our islands have with connectivity and ferries and whatever, and there's quite a push from particularly the Shetland Islands, say, why can't we have subsea tunnels? They do it in the Faroes, why can't they do it here? Yeah. I think possibly raising the finance might be the barrier that we face that they don't.
So here's our insight number 11. Tunnels rather than ferries work for the Faroes.
We like to build tunnels and we like to build roads and bridges. This is the national national accounts. So it's the public investments that we have from 1998 to today. And you can see the blue, the big one. That is infrastructure. So the Faroese politicians, they love to build roads and subsea tunnel and tunnels. I think we are the only country that has a roundabout in a subsea tunnel. Very famous Faroese artist has made a dancing ring because we have chain dances in our culture around the roundabout. So it's quite famous, but it's costly. We have 21 tunnels, where 4 are subsea tunnels, and in kilometers, it's 75.6 kilometers.
That degree of investment that they've managed to finance, that's what's joined up all these islands, and it has given them payback. And she used the word, an investment. It's not just an expense, it's actually for a purpose.
We've got the Queensferry crossing. Westminster refused to put up the money for that, which they could have on the basis of it being a project of national importance, the way that there are some, but they always seem to be in England. And we get charged a bit for those projects of national importance, and they refused to do it for the Queensferry crossing. So the SNP government in Holyrood got it done. They got it done under budget, and they got it done with their own, finding their own investment for it. So it's kind of like the lack of long-term, and you mentioned climate change and everything. It's the same thing, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Kind of see far enough ahead to go, we'll have to do this now, otherwise our grandchildren are going to be in one hell of a mess.
Yeah, it's going to cost a lot more to fix than it to prevent. But the other thing with taking that long-term view as well, the other thing is we don't seem to have any capital investment budget because of Labour's austerity, or Labour putting a red coat on Tory austerity. So how they managed to get the funding for the Queensferry Bridge doesn't mean they could do it now.
Going back to Commonweal, our green plan, our home plan, which they brought out, they made that point. It's costed and it's paid back. They work out how it could be paid back over, I think it was 25 years, something like that. It's perfectly possible to do it if you take the long-term view. But if you just go, well, we need so much just now, oh, no, can't do that.
Having seen the beauty of the imagination of a roundabout in a subsea tunnel painted by an artist, something a bit more prosaic, but actually quite important, is financial regulation. This is Andrew Murray, who's one of the Scottish Currency Group members, just making a point quite well, I think.
So our insight number 12 is the importance of controlling our financial rulebooks.
At present, all regulatory activities for financial services are directed and enforced from London. The rules governing our financial sector are created and they are managed from London. People in London get to decide what companies in Scotland can do, what industries they work with, who's allowed to work for them, what they sell, and how they conduct their business. Take a moment to think about that. That's a level of control. If we want to be independent, we need to empower the Scottish Treasury to control the Scottish financial sector. We want to avoid the crashes that seem to recur from time to time. Financial services in Scotland are a large part of our economy. It's currently around 9%. And you let that be regulated from London. We want to build a financial sector, but you must control the regulatory process. And the Currency Group has been discussing it, and the broad proposal is as follows. We need to run and own the rulemaking process. It's essential that Scotland assumes responsibility for creating and enforcing the financial regulations. And the proposal is that you maintain the existing regulations. Scotland would initially retain that regulatory structure and framework. You ensure stability while preparing to make the necessary adjustments. Over time, you can develop improved systems, and a Scottish Treasury may be aimed to implement more efficient and forward-thinking systems and investment products. You can drive strategic investment, and this newfound control will allow us the key channel investments into projects that stimulate and sustain our economy. E.g., you might use special tax incentives for pension funds. You might underwrite investments that are being made into green projects or renewable projects or things that develop our economy. Scotland would need to monitor the EU regulations so that we can see how that's developing and keeping our options open as to either rejoining or just generally remaining aligned. So what exactly are we talking about? Well, we're referring to insurance companies, banks, investment firms, IFAs, mortgage brokers, life brokers, pensions, investments. There's a significant part of the Scottish economy, and a smooth transition is more important than anything else. Currently, the Scottish investment market's valued about 500 billion and is worth about 10 billion to the Scottish economy. So these are quite big numbers. We need to get that right. So what do we need to consider? It's the scope of the work. The range of activities covered are extensive. There's 157 rule books managed just by the Prudential Regulatory Authority and 57 by the Financial Conduct Authority. Prudential Regulatory Authority deals with the managing of the liquidity of firms. So that's the people that manage, that monitor the boards of companies to make sure that they're monitoring the finance of that company. The FCA is the Financial Conduct Authority. They're the people that deal with market practices, how they retail products, how they sell the products, how they advertise the products. So there's two kind of levels of regulation in there. But if we're to be independent, we need to control them and what's happening in our country. We need a plan for the transition, and we need to retain the existing commercial links. We need a plan for the future to reinstate links with the EU and maintain the existing links as we're going forward.
I remember that talk, actually. I mean, I happened to bump into Ian Stewart afterwards. I said, I'm completely amazed that I've just been captivated by a talk on financial regulatory structures, but he was so good about just laying it out, and without knowing anything about the detail of all those 150 whatever it was books of regulations. He just got it clearly over how to move to keep it smooth, and then once you've done that, then you can start and kind of change things according to what kind of Scotland we're going to be developing. I just really enjoyed it. Maybe not everyone's cup of tea though.
It was the size of the 157 rule books.
Yeah, I know.
You think, is somebody looking at this? Well, clearly the Scottish Currency Group are, but whether somebody in the Scottish government's looking at it, who knows? The lesson that he laid out there is you can't be independent if you've got London controlling what your companies can do, and he's absolutely right.
Yeah, and I thought he was making the point, which I know I think some people were objecting to, but he was making the point. Look, you have to keep the transition smooth. The way to do that is just to take on board what's currently the UK 157 books worth and structures, and just straight that over wholesale. There you are. It's got continuity. People are not going to get frightened. And after that, then you start to make it our own. But to do it gradually. And I mean, I know some people didn't like that, but I just thought, well, that's just common sense. That's just kind of pragmatic approach to
practical.
doing it. Yeah,
absolutely.
So we've covered the 12 insights that we got, but we always like to give you an extra. So here is a bonus insight, and it's Professor Richard Murphy explaining why tax is not the enemy.
Richard Murphy was also part of the conference, and the lesson here is that tax is not the enemy.
The tax system that the UK has is not fit for purpose in an independent Scotland, in my opinion. In particular, Scotland would need to reform the way in which tax is administered. The UK tax authority at present, HM Revenue and Customs, is run as if it's a private limited company. And it has a board that is made up entirely of people who basically come from large firms or banks. That is not representative of the people of the UK. So we have to have people who understand how the economy works, but how it works for real people and real businesses, and how it also works within the macro economy. And that tax as a tool for recovering money from the economy is also the single most powerful single instrument available to the potential government of Scotland to influence the way in which it shapes the society of Scotland in the way that its government will then want. Tax transparency is key to the way in which the Scottish government must work. If it is to really succeed in taking people with it, tax at the moment is viewed as an enemy. Tax shouldn't be viewed as an enemy by people. Tax is the inevitable consequence of having a government engaged in the delivery of services of benefit to the people of Scotland.
That was news to me about the board and who's kind of made up on HMRC. And actually, I'll tell you what it brought to mind. I was on Twitter this morning, and there was a tweet I saw, and it was an advert actually saying, well, the Labour government are about to increase taxes. Let us work with you as an individual so that we can work out how you can pay as least amount of tax as possible. And I just thought, yeah, that's the trouble, isn't it? But if everyone does that, then the rest of most of the population who are not in the category of able to have a financial advisor like that suffer for it, because as Richard just said there, tax is the powerful tool that a government can have, and once you get the tax coming in, that's part of how you decide what you can do with it, how you can shape your own economy and your own nation. So.
And also the people who can afford to hoard their money, they don't spend that. It doesn't go back into the economy.
Exactly.
They're just adding it to the pile. Now, again, Richard had some suggestions. People talk about a wealth tax, and he says, yes, wealth taxes, but not a wealth tax. But here's some examples of what taxes we could have.
Society is at the moment, as far as I can see, deeply divided by unequal distribution of income and wealth, in some ways even more so than the rest of the UK. That's particularly because we know that there's a very unfair distribution of land ownership in Scotland. if the tax system of Scotland is not only going to be fiscally relevant in the sense that it actually raises the revenue to counter the risk of inflation that results from the government spending, it also has to be socially relevant. This division within Scotland of income and wealth is something that tax system has to tackle, is the point I'm making. Any Scottish government that doesn't make this at a core objective is going to fail to meet the needs of Scottish society. So we need wealth taxes, but we don't, and I will make the point very clear somewhere on here, we don't eventually need a wealth tax as such. I am a pragmatist when it comes to tax, and I'm going to be a pragmatist when it comes to the role of wealth tax within a Scottish economy after independence. There will be a great deal to deal with these stresses that wealth is creating inside the Scottish economy. It's dividing the society. It's putting far too much money in the hands of those who don't spend it, and therefore have very low multiplier effects as a consequence of their earnings. The money that the wealthy hold doesn't tend to fund innovation. The wealthy are incredibly reluctant to take risk because the most important thing for them is preserving their wealth, not taking risk to innovate. Status is the only thing that really matters to them. Power is concentrated as a consequence, and resources are denied to the people who need it. Let's be clear, we don't need wealth taxes to create revenue. We know governments can do that, but we do need tax to manage the consequences of revenue spending. So to create a fairer Scotland, we need to raise additional taxes from wealth for two fundamental reasons. One, to tackle the inequality. Two, to relieve poverty. We need a capital gains tax charged at income tax rates. Scotland should do this. It's glaringly obviously necessary. It's incredibly politically popular. If the UK doesn't do it, who cares? Scotland needs to be talking about this as a source of revenue for an independent Scotland. There also needs to be reform to inheritance taxes. They are incredibly generous to the very wealthy at present, who can take advantage of reliefs and allowances, particularly agricultural property reliefs, many of which apply to landed estates quite inappropriately, and the arrangements for businesses and trusts are also too generous. There needs to be an investment income surcharge in Scotland. An investment income surcharge is the equivalent of national insurance, but charged on investment income. It would go through the tax return of a person with significant investment income. By that, I mean anybody who might have more than £5,000 a year from investment income, which is a significant sum, in my opinion, and they would be charged an additional income tax rate on this. It existed until 1985. Margaret Thatcher got rid of it. It worked. There would need to be a change to the reliefs on gifts and allowances. One of the great frustrations I feel that for Scotland has at present inside the current absurd tax rules is that, for example, the Holyrood Parliament can change the income tax rate, but it can't change the rate of allowances and reliefs on things like pension contributions. Those pension contributions are at present costing the UK as a whole roughly 70 billion a year in terms of subsidy, or 7 billion roughly in terms of Scotland's cost to this, maybe very slightly less. It would be possible to recover 1.5 billion in Scotland at present by restricting those reliefs to basic rate only. It would be simple, it would be straightforward, it could be done at a moment's notice. It's just the devolution settlement doesn't allow it. An independent Scotland must talk about this. VAT should be charged on financial services in an independent Scotland. It would make no sense not to. Corporation tax would need to be charged at higher rates, and also significantly less generous reliefs, because at the moment they are providing far too many reliefs for investment, which are not being matched by new investment as a consequence. And there would be a need for a progressive land tax in Scotland, particularly to deal with that problem of the sports and leisure estates. These can all come before a wealth tax is ever needed.
I do think Richard Murphy does tend to sort of say that would be quite straightforward, and I'm thinking, I wonder if it's really that straightforward. But let's take him at his word. If all of that would be really straightforward to do, then wouldn't it be nice if the Scottish government were just laying out, this is what we do. We've taken some advice. Maybe they'll not take all of that advice, but presumably they would take the land tax bit of it, and some of those others seem to make sense as well. When you think about it, all Richard Murphy was saying was, well, there's two problems: inequalities and poverty.
Yes.
And let's create a tax landscape that will start to diminish those. I mean, you'd hope whatever Scottish government we have in power is going to want to do those sorts of things. So if only they'd get if you're watching anyone in the SNP or the Scottish government, get a move on.
Or Westminster, give us the powers.
Oh well, I haven't. Oh well, yeah,
things.
okay, give us the powers, and we'll get on with it. That isn't going to happen.
No, and there's the final lesson from the conference.
And yes, and that's right. But that conference was just so good. I was really, really pleased, to be over there listening. I mean, I had to go and have a bit of a breather at times because there was so much to kind of take in. But yeah, it was just great. And God, well done, Scottish Currency Group, for putting it on board, getting all these people, organised to come and talk. Brilliant.
Oh, so thanks for listening, everybody. That's our 12 insights plus a bonus. And we will put the link in the notes to the Scottish Currency Group's YouTube channel, where you can find the full version of not just those sessions we've taken highlights from, but others that we haven't covered at all. You can also watch the video version of this podcast on our YouTube channel if you'd like to. And we'll be back again next week with another podcast. So we'll catch you later. Bye now.